This is the CFF Sites Week 3 College Fantasy Football Show. My name is Joe DeSalvo, the voice of the CFF Site, and here we are 3 weeks into the season. And for me, looking at the show and looking at the notes that I have for this week, this is all about the running backs. I have so many notes when it comes to running backs this week. It's not going to be funny. So chances are you're going to have one of these players that I'm going to talk about this week because the list is long, but that's not all that I'm going to talk about. I mean, we've got a lot of things to talk about. I mean, offenses that are seemingly dead right now. And then also going to just touch upon what we're getting into. And we talk about this every year, the topic of late scratches, injuries, what to do, how do you find that information out? And let me just say right here off the top of the show that if you are not in the CFF Sites Discord server, then you are behind the 8 ball when it comes to getting a lot of last-minute injury news on players. I mean, look, if you were wired into the Discord on Saturday, or even before that during the week, you knew that Frank Harris wasn't going to play. You knew that Dominic Richardson was going to end up not playing. George Halani, Boise State, running back Caleb Johnson for Iowa, Evan Stewart, receiver Texas A&M, Jaden Ott, running back Cal. I mean, if you were wired into the Discord on Saturday, you knew that that not any of those guys were going to be playing and that you were going to need to make some sort of a lineup adjustments. We talk about it every week. We talk about it in the preseason. There's a lot of information to be had in the Discord, probably none more important than game day information when it comes to late breaking player news. Mike does a good job. I try to find as much information as I can, but the Discord is just a big credit to all of the subscribers and members of the CFF Site. And it's a big crowdsourcing project that goes on that tries to grab as much information, late breaking information as we can on players around the country that are questionable. And look, even when you do get word that some of those players are going to be out there are times where it might, bite you a little bit. There was, news that was circulating that Quinshaw Judkins was not going to play for Ole Miss in their matchup against Georgia Tech. He did play. He did have a rushing touchdown. He did not have a big game. So if you started a player for him, you probably were okay. You were getting wins. We were getting wins that Devin Neal may not play for Kansas late Saturday night in that matchup against Nevada. And those are really the tough ones, the late night matchups, because you almost have to pivot and make those changes early in the day while you still have some flexibility with your bench players. And for some of you guys that may have been kind of wired into that news, may have sat Devin Neal last Saturday night and you missed out on a couple of touchdowns. But the alternative is that you get wind of that and he does sit out and you take a goose egg. So there's plenty to be said and a lot of reasons why you should be wired into the CFF Sites Discord server on game day. And many thanks to all of you guys, members, and Mike as well, for bringing you guys a lot of late breaking news on game day to make your adjustments in your DFS lineups and in your weekly college fantasy football league lineups. But, I said this was the week of the running back, and we're going to get into that. But first, man, I just have to talk about a few teams. Like when you look at the lay of the land right now, and I'm probably going to concentrate more so in the Power 5 conferences than anywhere else, because that's where the majority of college fantasy football gets played. You got Power 5 only, you've got full FBS, but I mean, look, first of all, let's start. I've got 4 teams written down: Alabama, Houston, Oklahoma State, and Pitt. Like, what is going on over there? Now, I know Ty Buckner got the start this week for Alabama, and Ty Simpson came in that game, and I know the weather did not do those guys any favors, but before that weather was coming down, Ty Buckner, I saw him throw what seemed to be like 7 or 8 passes. He just didn't seem. I was like, okay, that looked bad, right? Maybe just jitters, 1 or 2 series, get that out of your system. But no, he was hitting the shoelaces on almost every play. He wasn't hitting guys in stride. He's just not the answer. He's not going to do it. I have to admit, I didn't watch much of Ty Simpson. I was kind of flipping around after that, but it doesn't seem like he was any better than what Jalen Milroe offered them. It wouldn't surprise me if Jalen Milroe is the starting quarterback next week when Alabama plays their next game. Going over to Houston, just not a lot there. Dana Holgerson, the head coach there, described their offense as embarrassing. He said he wouldn't even consider making some changes. So let's see what that entails. I think you got to be a little nervous if you're fantasy owners of quarterback Donovan Smith. I don't anticipate a quarterback change coming just yet. I think he's going to get a little bit longer leash, but you never know. Be on guard there. Oklahoma State, look, I think I'm throwing in you've got to kind of throw in the towel on Oklahoma State. I just don't want any part of that. They got manhandled by South Alabama. Man, I just remember the days of Gundy having that stud wide receiver one. He occasionally give you a good running back, maybe a quarterback. There's just nothing to be had on that Oklahoma State roster. Looks dead to me. And then talking about dead, let's talk about that Pitt offense, right? Where they go get quarterback Phil Jurkovec from Boston College. He is 18 of 52 passing in his last two games against West Virginia and Cincinnati. That's just not going to get it done. Quite frankly, it's garbage. There's a lot of concern about what's going on there with the running backs. Quite frankly, you've got to worry about the whole offense when your quarterback is going 18 of 52 against some, what I would just consider average Power 5 competition, what they're going to be facing week in and week out. That's not a good sign for the Pitt offense, and a terrible sign if you have running back Rodney Hammond. And look, I have some shares of Rodney Hammond, but when you have a quarterback that can't make plays and convert, now look, it may be deeper than that. There may be line issues. I don't know what it is, but I just know that when I see Phil Jurkovec at 18 of 52 against West Virginia and Cincinnati, and then I watched Thomas Castellanos for Boston College and what he was able to do against Florida State, I was just like, wow, okay. Now I know why they really weren't that worried that they lost him, because Thomas Castellanos single-handedly almost put BC over the top against Florida State, which is surprising to me. And look, that guy's rushed for at least 60 yards in 3 straight games. He was really good with his legs, and against other competition, not named Florida State, I think he's going to have a pretty decent season. I can see him having some games and some matchups on the schedule where you're going to want to start him in some weeks. He looked that good to me. I wouldn't be surprised if Thomas Castellanos is on some fantasy rosters and if he gets some starts in some 2 quarterback leagues, particularly in P5 only leagues. So let's go there, because that's where we're looking at with quarterback. Now, when I round out some of the quarterback notes, what I have on here as well, because I always already mentioned Houston as well, and being a little nervous if you're a Donovan Smith owner, I think we do have to mention Texas Tech. I do think it's worth a mention because Behren Morton did come in, lead a scoring drive for Texas Tech, made it look really easy when he wasn't there. He did throw an interception. Tyler Shugg wasn't terribly efficient against Tarleton State, but he was good enough. I don't anticipate a quarterback change coming there, but I'm not saying I wouldn't be nervous if I was fantasy owners of Tyler Shugg, but I just don't think a change is coming there at Texas Tech, at least not right now. And then another quarterback, here's something that I want to mention too. I think in all of the Colorado hype, lost in that game is freshman Braden Fowler-Nicolosi, who went 34 of 47 for 367 and 3 touchdowns against Colorado. Now, Colorado's defense is not that good. I get it. But that kid made some really good throws. And the reason why I say this and really want to kind of tout him a little bit is I think this bodes really well for you guys out there that have Torrey Horton or have a couple of the other Colorado State receivers, particularly Torrey Horton, who really just bossed that Colorado secondary. But Braden Fowler-Nicolosi, we were wondering if Norvell has his quarterback that he can really elevate this program to a point where he brought Nevada before he exited the stage there. Fowler-Nicolosi may be that guy. Looks like the guy that's going to get him there. So I really was impressed by him. Real quick before we jump into a lot of the running backs, let's mention a little bit of some of the receivers that I have notes on. Gage Larvadain, wide receiver, Miami of Ohio, continues his hot start. I mean, look, you just want this guy to stay healthy. We know the targets he's going to get in that Miami of Ohio offense. 2 more scores this past weekend in the Red Hawks upset of Cincinnati. And he was really the wide receiver that I really wanted to single out. There's a few more that we can get into. Luther Burden is one that I wanted to bring up, and not for no other reason than the fact that, I'm glad that this guy is having a breakout season. I was not high on him last year. Quite frankly, I was a little doubtful going into this season. 7 catches in 3 straight games in the first 3 games of the year, 3 touchdowns. He's gone over 96 yards, all 3 games over 110 twice. Really instrumental in that win over Kansas State. It looks like you guys that have been patient enough on Luther Burden, you're finally going to get some dividends on that investment on your shares of Luther Burden. And so that really takes care of a lot of the non-running back conversation, and that's where this show's really going to dominate. And let's just start right up the top with Braylon Allen over at Wisconsin. The reason why I want to mention Braylon Allen is, during that game, there was a time when Chez Melisi had more carries than Braylon Allen. Mordecai was doing better on the ground than Braylon Allen. And I saw the buzz. I saw all the negativity in the Discord that was being mentioned. And then all of a sudden, Braylon Allen finishes with 12 carries, 94 yards, and 2 touchdowns this past week. And, here's one of those things. We talked about this in the beginning of the year. This is an offense that when there's 2 backs, Longo is not afraid to use both backs. He knows what he has with Braylon Allen, but it looks like, and look, I think it's fair to say after 3 games, this just doesn't look like an offense where you're going to have a running back that's going to tote the rocks 20 times a game. It looks like it's going to be Melisi and Allen that are going to alternate back there. My guess is that each one of them are going to probably get between 10 to 15 carries a game, and then you're going to sprinkle some rushing in there with Tanner Mordecai. It could be frustrating on a week-to-week basis. I just don't think. Remember, we're spoiled. We're used to seeing that Wisconsin running back 1 get 20 to 25 carries on a week-to-week basis, and I just don't see that being the case this year in this offense, particularly with Chez Melisi staying healthy. Now, we're talking about rotation of running backs, and I think you have to immediately go to Kansas State, where you've got Treshaun Ward and DJ Giddens right now, who I think both of those guys combined have 1 rushing touchdown all year. This is a Kansas State offense under Chris Kleiman that really hasn't changed much other than the fact that they lost Deuce Vaughn, who's been there, for 4 years. So again, spoiled by Deuce Vaughn, they really rode him. And now all of a sudden you've got Will Howard there at quarterback, vulturing some carries around the goal line, Treshaun Ward, DJ Giddens splitting time. And now if you're a fantasy owner of either of those 2 guys, you've got to contemplate, one, whether or not you even want to start them right now, because there's no guarantee of a volume number of carries or whether or not they're even going to get in the end zone. And so here's the ultimate dilemma. The question is, you have to look out and see, how are you going to see, do you see yourself starting these guys in the next 2, 3, 4 weeks? If they're both healthy and they're going to rotate, and you're not going to start them, you then have to start wondering, am I keeping them just for depth, or am I going to start them down the line? And so I can see where some fantasy owners of both Ward and Giddens are jumping ship right now. And that's not the only place where people are jumping ship right now. And I'll talk about a couple of those places right now, because let's go to Baylor next, right? Where if you got the news of Dominic Richardson being out this past week, you had the luxury of, if you had a Richard Reese share, or if you had some shares of Richard Reese, saying, okay, this is his game. Long Island, Baylor should dominate, give him 15 carries, get his 100 yards and a touchdown. But I have to tell you, when I look at that game, they gave Reese 12 carries, right? Where's my notes on Reese? Reese had 12 carries and had 2 touchdowns, which was great if you were able to use him as a substitute for Dominic Richardson. Like, if you got that news and you were able to pivot and make that move, congrats. It worked out really well for you. But I have to tell you, there was also moments where those fantasy owners were probably a little bit nervous as well, because they weren't using Reese as much as I thought they would. And then they rolled a freshman in there, Dawson Pendergrass. And he rushed the ball 21 times for 111 yards and a touchdown. Now, this game was not out of hand for most of the way. This was a game that was still within a couple of scores, 3 scores into the fourth quarter. So this wasn't them rolling Pendergrass out in mop-up duty. It felt like to me that if Richard Reese is really going to be the back of next year and moving forward, he'd have been the guy that got a little bit more workload. And I just worry about whether or not Richard Reese is going to stay at Baylor much longer, because I don't really feel that they're going to use him that much once Richardson comes back. They're already rolling Pendergrass into the fold, giving him 21 carries this past week. He looks like the back of Baylor's future and not Richard Reese. My advice, if Dominic Richardson's back, take that Richard Reese performance and kind of use it as your swan song, cut bait, and move on, because I don't have a lot of hope there with Richard Reese. Boise State, another name that we got named, George Holani, was not going to be active. So that was great news for Ashton Jeanty owners. Jeanty put a couple of balls on the turf, which led him to take a back seat a little bit in that matchup. He still had 3 scores. He's still going to be an incredible asset. But here's the dilemma now. If you have George Holani, we're getting to the point now where he's missed 2 games. You now cannot even afford to start George Holani until you actually see him play now. So if you have Ashton Jeanty, he's going to start for you next game. George Holani probably won't even start for you if you even know he's playing next game, because you just don't know. We don't know what's going on with George Holani and the nature of that injury, or if it's long-term, if it's nagging. And so Ashton Jeanty owners, I think you've got to feel good. George Holani owners, I don't think you can play the guy until we actually see him play. Now, another guy that we've seen play, and, I mentioned this on the show last week, and I think even the week before, is the Utah running back situation with Cam Rising out and Nate Johnson at quarterback, in my opinion, certainly devalues Ja'Quinden Jackson. Nate Johnson has scored a rushing touchdown in all 3 games this year. Ja'Quinden Jackson, look, it's a roll of the dice right now. Cam Rising's not there. They're going to do some other things with that offense, and I could not blame anyone. I don't know if I would jump ship on Ja'Quinden Jackson, but I would certainly strongly consider him for my bench and leaving him on the bench until that Utah offense gets a change at quarterback, or they seem to put a little bit more faith in Ja'Quinden Jackson. I know he limped off at some point in the game, and guys in the Discord were like up in a frenzy. Here we go again. I don't know if there's something lingering with him, that if he tweaks an ankle wrong, it's just nagging. He's coming out of a game, but I'm just not 100% confident in that one right now. And I'll tell you, there's some other situations that's going on right now. And we'll go right to the MAC, right? Because the Mid-American Conference right now, there's a lot of running backs that we can touch on. First, let's talk about the good. Ball State running back Marquez Cooper. You've got to feel really great now. The Cardinals come out of matchups against Kentucky and Georgia to start the year. He rips off 22 carries for 177 yards and a touchdown. I know it was only Indiana State. I get that. But we're about to see Marquez Cooper in that Ball State offense get into MAC play. And we said it in the preseason with guys like Marquez Cooper. We knew the Kentucky game was on the horizon, and we knew that the Georgia game was on the schedule. It was all about making it through those 2 games healthy and getting them ready for MAC play. You fantasy owners, hopefully you've survived up until now. I think what you got this past weekend is what we're going to start seeing out of Marquez Cooper the rest of the way. Gavin Garcia, Kent State. I was one of those people, look, I like taking stabs on the waiver wire in deep leagues with matchups. I saw Gavin Garcia. He got 18 carries in both of the first 2 games of the year against Arkansas and Central Florida. All of a sudden, they took a step down in competition. I said, if he's going to get that workload, he's going to have a pretty decent game. 21 carries, 125 yards, and 2 touchdowns. I think he did that within 2.5, 3 quarters before he left the game. I think, remember, I like Gavin. Kai Thomas was a guy that I liked in the beginning of the year for Kent State. There wasn't a lot to like. I thought it was going to be Kai Thomas and Trell Harris at receiver. Kai Thomas's waiver, I don't think for transfer ever got approved. Gavin Garcia is the guy, and I think you're going to have some MAC value in Gavin Garcia. Do not be afraid to go get him off the waiver wire. I think that's the guy that the Golden Flashes offense is going to ride a little bit through MAC play. And then a couple of areas of concern in the MAC while we're there. Say Bangura, I have to say, look, he, up until this point, the last 2 weeks, O'Shan Allison has gotten more rushing attempts than Say Bangura. That's really worrisome for me. I don't know if there's something going on there, but that really is interesting to me. I want to see how that plays out going into MAC play, where I think Bangura is going to get the lion's share of carries. But I have to say, up until this point, that really is a concern for me. And I do have some shares of Bangura, and I'm a little nervous about that one. And then Samson Evans for Eastern Michigan. You know, it was a little disappointing that he was out-carried by Jalen Jackson this week. Jackson had 12 rushing attempts, and Samson Evans only had 8. You got to remember, Samson Evans is coming off of a 2022 season where he carried the ball 220-plus times. This is a guy that he's no stranger to a heavy workload. There were rumors in the preseason that maybe he had an injury, and I just wonder, is that it, or is he easing? Are they easing him in? Are they looking to share? Are they looking to get Jackson a few more touches? Samson Evans was really good last year, and he was good, very good as the game went on, and got a lot of carries. 8 touches, 8 rushing attempts in the game this past weekend, with Jalen Jackson getting 12. Again, nervous about the long-term potential of Samson Evans moving forward. I think we're okay, but these are the guys that I mentioned that, hey, warning signs are here. Pay attention, be alert. We may have to pivot in another week or two. And then all of a sudden, where guys pivoted, Darius Taylor, Minnesota, let's go there, right back into the Power 5 conferences. You know, a week ago against Eastern Michigan, 33 carries, 193 yards, and a touchdown. We didn't think we were going to see another Mo Ibrahim back this soon. And I said last week, maybe we were wrong. Well, we could be wrong. North Carolina game, 22 carries, 138 yards, and a touchdown. Darius Taylor has carried the ball 55 times now for 331 yards and 2 touchdowns in the last 2 weeks. It looks to me we're going to get that running back one with a heavy workload out of Minnesota, and it looks like it's going to be Darius Taylor. Now, another running back who really impressed me, and look, this guy was higher on our list, but Audric Estime. In the opening game of the year when they played over, when Notre Dame played Navy overseas, Audric Estime had a really good first couple of drives, and then he scored a touchdown. He fumbled. They took him out the game. I don't think he got into the game again till late in the third quarter, but he wound up finishing with like 90-something yards then. He's gone over 100 in both games since, and I have to tell you, looking at the Notre Dame schedule, if Audric Estime does not put the ball on the ground, he's in for a big year this year. You fantasy owners are going to be in for a huge year from him, bigger than he had last year. Moving forward, I think he's going to be a really good, consistent fantasy asset for you guys, as long as he avoids that running back bug. Another running back that I think guys should jump on, and I'm jumping all over the place, right? We're going back to the G5 level, but look, we have been waiting for Harrison Whaley at Wyoming. That Wyoming backfield has kind of taken some injury this season, and then they get that win at home against Texas Tech 2 weeks ago. They gave Texas everything they could handle this past weekend. That was a really close game until late third quarter when Texas made a couple of plays. Xavier Worthy made a big play. But the reason why I mentioned is Harrison Whaley. We were waiting for his return. 18 carries for 110 yards in a touchdown for that Wyoming offense. I expect to see Harrison Whaley get his 18 to 20-plus touches every week in that offense. And I think as long as he stays healthy, he's back to 100%. I think that's a player that's going to give you some consistent fantasy production week in and week out from here on out. Another running back. Let's go to BYU, where L.J. Martin, we got hints that he was going to take over from Aiden Robbins, the UNLV transfer. Well, look, he did nothing but cement himself atop that BYU running back depth chart. 23 carries for 77 yards and 2 touchdowns in that BYU win on the road at Arkansas. Impressive. LJ Martin, expect to see a heavy dose of him in the coming weeks for the Cougars. Nate Noel, running back, Appalachian State. This is one that I really am happy about. There was a lot of concerns. And look, here I missed on Nate Noel, and I'm really, really disappointed that I don't have many shares of Nate Noel because I've always loved targeting that Appalachian State back. But we mentioned when the offensive coordinator was coming back to Appalachian State a couple of years ago, he kind of had that thunder and lightning package with Nate Noel and Cameron Peoples. Cameron Peoples was more of the red zone short yardage guy. Nate Noel was a 1,000-yard back that year. Well, that Appalachian State was a little bruised up at the beginning of the year, but look, Nate Noel right now is carrying that offense all 3 games this year. He has gotten at least 24 carries. He's gone north of 115 yards in all 3 games. He had 178 this past week. He has scored in all 3 games. If Nate Noel is going to continue to get this type of workload, he's going to be one of the better backs, fantasy backs in the country this year. No doubt about that. Running back that I want to mention and get a note on is because I think this is a big one to mention as well. And there's 2, because we talked about Alabama offense, right? And so we wonder about, is Jase McClellan going to really hold on to that running back 1 spot there? That I said this, it's tough to hold out and hold a lot of judgment based on the weather, based on the way that the system played out. But Roydell Williams looked like the better back in that game. Rain or no rain, he looked like the better back. And now you wonder, is Roydell Williams going to supplant Jase McClellan at that running back 1 spot for Alabama? I can see that happening. Why not, right? The other thing, too, is you look at Georgia. You had Daijun Edwards come back, 20 carries, 118 yards, and a touchdown in that win over South Carolina when they were down 2 scores. Now, I'll say this, for as good as Edwards looked in coming back in his first action of the year, we all know this. It is very unlikely that you're going to see that kind of production or that kind of a workload out of a running back 1 or a top running back at Georgia. They're just too deep. They were behind. They had to play catch up. They came back and ripped off, I think, the last 28 points of the game. I forget what the number was, but they're going to be playing ahead for most of the games that they're in. And now even the Tennessee game doesn't even look that daunting on the Georgia schedule. Daijun Edwards, 21-18-1. For as much as I really love that performance, I'm not anticipating similar performances like that moving forward. I think Georgia's going to continue to spread it out and use that depth, because I mentioned this a couple of weeks back. It's teams like Georgia, teams like Ohio State, teams like Michigan. They're not going to be challenged many times during the season. They just have to stay healthy for when the big games come. And so since I mentioned Michigan and I mentioned Ohio State, let's go there real quick, because we're going to talk about the running back situation. Mayan Williams in the preseason. He was ranked in my top 85, 90 as well, probably I think in my top 60 because of, last year he and Travion Henderson was splitting time. Both of those guys were dinged up, hurt, and when one of them played and had the backfield to themselves, they were a fantasy monster, right? Well, look, now all of a sudden you've got Chip Trayanum in the picture now, in the fold in this Ohio State rotation where he's going to take a few carries away. I just think Mayan Williams is an afterthought right now when it comes to fantasy production. I think it's Travion Henderson and no one after that. I think if you've got Mayan Williams and you have Chip Trayanum, I don't know if many people have picked up Chip Trayanum, because I don't know if he was drafted in many leagues, but I can see where a lot of fantasy owners are cutting bait on Mayan Williams, and I wouldn't have a problem with that at all. The one that's a little more disheartening and I think discouraging, and I think the verdict is still out a little bit right now, is in the Michigan backfield. Because 2 years ago, going into 2022, we thought we would see a little bit more of Donovan Edwards, and we didn't get that. It was Blake Corum's show, and Donovan Edwards was there in a complimentary role. We thought that would change after we saw Edwards in the back end of last year and into the college football playoffs perform the way that he did in the Big Ten championship game, the playoff game. But Blake Corum's back, and it doesn't look like much has changed. It looks like they're running the same type of rotation that they were just a year ago. Now, will tougher games bring on a little bit more production for Donovan Edwards? Yeah, I do think that, especially in the passing game as well. I'm not willing to give up on Donovan Edwards yet, much like I threw with the towel in on Mayan Williams. But it looks like a mirror of 2022 right now with those two guys. You've got to feel great if you've got Blake Corum. And look, I thought when I had Corum ranked in the top 3, I thought he was too high. And I thought I might have been too low on Donovan Edwards. And it looks like that we were right on Blake Corum. And maybe we were wrong on Edwards again. It just seems like the guy's got all the talent in the world, but the way that they use him, it's just not made for fantasy success, at least not right now. And so for you guys with Edwards, you're looking for some of the tougher games when he can get some catches out of the backfield. And quite frankly, he's the insurance policy for Blake Corum right now. So that's my thoughts on the Michigan backfield. And then I want to go to Florida and Clemson as well. I'll go to Florida first. Florida coming off of that big win against Tennessee this past weekend. Trevor Etienne had the big game. It was Montrell Johnson who had the better performance the week before. Look, here's what I say. Florida's got 2 decent backs. I think you're playing those guys more so in deep full FBS leagues and Power 5 only leagues. In my opinion, the guy that's going to get the call more often on a week-to-week basis is going to vary, because I think that Napier is basically going to ride the hot hand. The guy who's running better that day is probably going to end up getting more carries and more touches in the game. It's the luxury of having 2 really good backs in an offense that doesn't have a lot more than the 2 backs. I expect to see Trevor Etienne and Montrell Johnson rotating throughout the year, all year round for Florida. And I think what you're going to see is that the guy that's having the better game is going to end up being the guy that's going to get the most carries that week. And I think that's going to rotate and could rotate on a week-to-week basis. Now, the last one that I really want to mention is over at Clemson, and that's Will Shipley, where last year, Will Shipley had 15 rushing touchdowns. So far through 3 games this year, he's got 0. Matter of fact, I think he caught the first touchdown of I think he scored Clemson's first touchdown of the season on a pass out of the backfield in that season opener against Duke. He hasn't scored since then. 15 rushing touchdowns last year, 0 through 3 games. Teammate Phil Maffa has 3. So, a lot of concern if you're a fantasy owner of Will Shipley. Phil Maffa in there. I don't believe that Phil Maffa is as good of a back as Will Shipley, but they're using him. He's getting carries that matter in the red zone. And right now, Will Shipley, who I believe for most of us was a top 10, top 12 preseason fantasy back, is not even living up to that hype. So, think about this. When you guys look, we talk about this every single year, and, you've got guys complaining in the Discord about Braylon Allen, right? Who's only got 12 touches, but he's gotten to the end zone twice this past week. You've got fantasy owners who drafted Raheem Sanders, who are going to lose 2 or 3 games from him from injury. You've got other fantasy owners who have drafted Will Shipley, 15 touchdowns last year on the ground, 0 so far through 3 games. So I don't know how optimistic you are as a Will Shipley owner. Everything's relative. And that's what I'm saying. Everything's relative. Sometimes you've got to be thankful that even though Braylon Allen may not be getting the 25 carries he's getting, he's still giving you enough to warrant a starting spot in your roster, even if it's a running back 2 right now, where there's guys that are starting Will Shipley as a running back 1, and he's turning up goose eggs in the end zone right now. So everything is relative. That is the joy and the pains of college fantasy football. And one of the joys is the fact that you get to build your lineup. You can rebuild your team through the waiver wire. Look, in the last 2 weeks, I've played in some leagues. I've got wins from the running back out at New Mexico, Krosky, I think it's Krosky Merritt. Couple of weeks ago, Gage Larvadine I picked up. He's paid off. I picked up Gavin Garcia this past week over at Kent State. I think if you were an owner of Jaden Ott and you were able to get the Cal backup running back, I think he went for over 100 and a touchdown. The waiver wire is what's going to do it for you on a week-to-week basis sometimes when you face in some of these matchups. Remember, we're 3 weeks in now. Excuse me. We're 3 weeks in now. You pretty much know what you're going to get moving forward. And sometimes you've got to be willing to play the matchup over the name that you have on your roster that you draft in the first or second round. I said everything's relative. Even, look, Braylon Allen, Jaquindon Jackson, which one would you rather have, right? So there's people out there that are complaining about Braylon Allen, but there's other people that drafted Raheem Sanders, who's hurt, Jaquindon Jackson, who hasn't done well, Will Shipley, who hasn't scored a touchdown. I mean, I can go on and on. I mean, you've got Rodney Hammond that's drafted in second and third rounds. I don't even know if he's got 120 yards on the ground total this year. Everything's relative. But it's also the greatest thing about college fantasy football. Use that waiver wire. Use the damn waiver wire and rebuild your roster and play the matchups. That's the fun of college fantasy football. I had someone text me this past week, this Gage Larvadine is a beast. And I was like, yeah, and it's the second year he's ever played college fantasy football. And I said, that's what makes college fantasy football so fun. It's not the Dejon Edwards that runs for 118 yards and a touchdown every week. It's the guys that can run for 3 or 4 touchdowns every week and get 150, 170 yards. That's college fantasy football at its finest right there. And the injury news and everything just goes along with it. There's, for as much joy as there is in college fantasy football, there's as much pain. And I think we love it the pain so much that we keep coming back and we get addicted to it. And that's just it. The highs are so high that it's so addicting and the lows are so low that all we want to do is redeem ourselves. So look, that's going to do it. That's the week 3 show. It was dominated by the running back landscape in college fantasy football right now, but that's where we needed to kind of sit down and digest the lay of the land and see what's going on. But that's it. Big week ahead for a lot of you guys. Week 4 on tap. A lot of non-conference games are coming to a close. We're going to start getting into the conference schedules for you guys that were sitting out there with the Banguras and the Coopers, a lot of those MAC players. This is the part of the season that you are waiting for. Hopefully you've been able to survive, get into this, what I call is like the middle third of the season right here and see if things change. Get back on that horse here. And hopefully some of you guys that have started behind the 8 ball can come out ahead, get yourself right back into contention. And for you guys that are kind of ahead right now with some of those names that I just mentioned, boy, you got to be looking and feeling pretty good going into the middle of the season. So look, that's going to do it for the week 3 show. Good luck to everybody this week. And like I mentioned, if you're not in, still get in, try to get in, come in, get that All-American Heisman membership, get into the Discord and get all that access on game day, all those injury notes, all those tidbits that you need to kind of keep you up to date with your college fantasy football team. That's going to do it, guys. My name is Joe DeSalvo, the voice of the CFF site, and I will be talking to you in week 4. Till then, good luck, everyone.